They say a Vermeer is priceless because of the secrets hidden in its layers of lead, white, and lapis lazuli. But my husband's iPhone 15 Pro Max was far more expensive, and its secrets were significantly more disgusting. I sat at my Louis XVI vanity, the morning light from Fifth Avenue cutting through the room like a cold diamond. At 62, I've learned that the most dangerous forgeries aren't the ones hanging in the Louvre. They're the ones sleeping in the silk sheets right next to you. I took a sip of my espresso from a gold-rimmed Tiffany & Co. cup, watching the steam rise. Arthur was in the shower, humming some jaunty tune he'd probably picked up at a jazz club I was too tired to visit. He was 55, at that peak of silver fox arrogance where a man thinks he's invisible just because he's wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit. He'd left his phone on the marble counter. A mistake. A fatal, amateur mistake. The notification didn't just pop up, it screamed. A hidden folder update. I've spent 40 years authenticating the unauthentic, spotting the one brushstroke that doesn't belong. My fingers didn't tremble, they were steady, the same way they were when I outbid a Russian oligarch for a Rembrandt in 2012. I bypassed the code, our anniversary, how cliché, and entered the vault. It was titled Foundation Assets. Arthur always did love a professional-sounding lie. I clicked, I breathed, I died a little. Then I woke up. The screen was a mosaic of betrayal. There was Serena, my 28-year-old lead curator, the girl I'd personally mentored, draped over the hood of my vintage Mercedes-Benz 300 SL in the Hamptons. In another, they were in a suite at the Plaza, the velvet curtains I'd chosen for the hotel's redesign framed behind her smug, youthful face. I felt a sharp, staccato rhythm in my chest. Beat, beat, pain, beat, beat, clarity. I scrolled further. It wasn't just the sex, it was the business. Photos of my private ledger, screenshots of wire transfers to a shell company in the Caymans. They weren't just having an affair, they were performing a surgical extraction of my life's work. Arthur hadn't just found a mistress, he'd found a business partner to help him retire on my corpse. I checked the time on my Cartier tank watch. 8:15 a.m. In exactly 4 hours, we were scheduled for a high-stakes board meeting at the Hearst Tower. Arthur was supposed to present a new digital growth strategy. Now I knew what the growth was. He wanted to dilute my shares, citing my waning energy and need for a quiet retirement. He'd even drafted the press release. I could see the PDF in the folder. Eleanor Sterling steps down. Arthur Sterling takes the helm. I felt a dry, sarcastic laugh bubble up in my throat. I looked at myself in the mirror. The Chanel No. 5 on my vanity smelled like a funeral. The shower stopped. The hum of the water was replaced by the silence of a predator about to be caught. I didn't put the phone back exactly where it was. I moved it 3 inches to the left. I wanted him to wonder. I wanted that tiny, microscopic seed of doubt to sprout in his mind while he toasted his success over his organic green juice. I stood up, smoothing my Dior dress. My knees didn't creak. My resolve didn't waver. I had billions of dollars, a reputation that spanned 3 continents, and a printer in my home office that was about to become the most important tool in the history of New York justice. Arthur thought 55 was the age of power. He was about to learn that 62 is the age of consequences. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the white oak floor like a firing squad. The game hadn't just changed. I had just bought the board, the pieces, and the entire building. Arthur emerged from the bathroom, a cloud of expensive steam following him. He was wrapped in a plush fret robe, his damp silver hair slicked back with the kind of practiced precision that only a man who spends 40 minutes in front of a mirror can achieve. He looked at me, a soft, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Morning, Al. You look intense today. Board meeting jitters?" He reached for his iPhone, the one I had just moved 3 inches. I watched his eyes. A flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, crossed his face when he noticed the displacement. But he dismissed it. Men like Arthur think the world shifts to accommodate them, not that they've been watched. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the heat of the gold rim against my lip. Not jitters, Arthur. Just clarity. I was just thinking about the Dutch masters, how they used light to hide the rot in the fruit. He laughed, a rich, hollow sound. "Always the philosopher. I'll see you at the tower at noon. I have a few things to finalize with Serena first." The moment the elevator doors hissed shut behind him, I moved. I didn't go to the kitchen. I went to my sanctuary, the home office that housed my MacBook Pro and my professional-grade Epson SureColor printer. This wasn't just a piece of office equipment. It was the machine I used to proof million-dollar auction catalogs. Today, it would print the most expensive collection of Arthur's life. I opened the folder again. My eyes stung, but I refused to let a single tear touch my Dior silk. I selected the photos, high resolution, glossy. I adjusted the color balance to ensure Serena's smug expression was perfectly rendered in 4K clarity. Click. The first page slid out. It was a shot of them in my Mercedes-Benz, her hand on his knee, his wedding ring, the one I'd chosen at Tiffany's, glinting in the sun. I felt a surge of cold, dark humor. If I were a lesser woman, I'd be throwing plates. But I'm a Sterling. We don't break things, we devalue them. I packed the prints into 20 silver-foiled envelopes, the kind we used for VIP gala invitations. Each one felt like a lead weight. I tucked them into my Birkin bag and headed out. My driver was waiting in the Maybach. Starbucks on 72nd, James, the quiet one. I needed to meet Marcus. Marcus was 65, a retired FBI art crime specialist who now spent his days consulting for people like me who had too much money and too many enemies. He was already there when I walked in, blending into the morning crowd of frantic New Yorkers with a MacBook Air and a venti dark roast. He didn't look up when I sat down. He just pushed a small USB drive toward me across the scarred wooden table. "It's worse than the cheating, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice like gravel. "The shell company in the Caymans isn't just for his retirement. He's been using it to facilitate the sale of private inventory, your private inventory." I felt the air leave my lungs. "The Vermeer?" I whispered. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes filled with a grim sympathy. "He's had a master forger in Queens working on a replica for 6 months. The switch happened 2 weeks ago while you were in London for the Sotheby's Gala. The real one is currently sitting in a crate in a warehouse near JFK, waiting for a flight to Dubai." I gripped my Starbucks cup so hard, the plastic lid popped. This wasn't just a midlife crisis. This was a decapitation. Arthur wasn't just looking for a younger model. He was trying to liquidate my soul. I looked at the gray New York sky through the window. I felt 62 years of weight on my shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, I felt light. "Dangerous. Can you stop the shipment?" I asked. Marcus nodded. "I already have. But if you want the arrest to stick, you need him to admit the theft during the meeting. You need him to think he's won." I stood up, leaving my coffee untouched. I had a funny thought. I wondered if Serena knew she was dating a man who was about to trade his Tom Ford suits for a bright orange jumpsuit. The irony was almost too much to bear. I felt a sudden urge to laugh, a hysterical, bubbling sensation. I imagined Arthur trying to explain the composition of a prison cell. I walked back to the car, my mind racing. I had 3 hours. 3 hours to prepare the final act of the Sterling legacy. I pulled out my Kindle and tried to read a few pages of The 48 Laws of Power to steady my nerves, but the words blurred. I didn't need a book to tell me how to handle a traitor. I had the silver envelopes. I had the FBI on speed dial. And I had the one thing Arthur never factored into his plan. A woman who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. The Hearst Tower at noon is a monument to glass and ego. It rises above Manhattan like a jagged crystal, reflecting the ambitions of people who think they are too important to fail. I walked through the lobby, my heels clicking a rhythmic, military cadence on the polished stone. My reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showed a woman who looked like she was heading to a coronation, not a slaughter. I adjusted my Dior blazer. I checked my reflection. I looked 62, but a sharp, dangerous 62. The kind of age that carries the weight of 1,000 battles won and the scars of the few lost. The elevator ascended silently, a vacuum of pressurized air and high-stakes tension. My heart was a steady drum in my chest. Thump, thump. Ready. Thump, thump. Cold. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, the air smelled of ozone and expensive espresso. The boardroom was already half full. The men in their charcoal suits looked like ravens perched on a wire, waiting for something to die. At the head of the long obsidian table sat Arthur. He looked magnificent. He was wearing the limited edition Rolex I'd bought him for his 50th birthday. his tanned hand resting casually on a leather-bound folder. Next to him, Serena was arranging papers. She was wearing a skirt so short it was practically a legal liability, and a smile that was far too bright for a woman whose job was ostensibly to archive dusty oil paintings. She looked at me, her eyes flicking down to my shoes, and then back up with a patronizing glimmer of pity. She thought she was the future. She thought I was the museum exhibit. Arthur stood up, his smile wide and hollow. "Eleanor, darling, you're just in time. We were about to discuss the Q4 projections and the transition plan." He pulled out a chair for me, a gesture of chivalry that felt like a slap in the face. I sat down, placing my Birkin bag on the table with a deliberate thud. I pulled out my iPad Pro and a sleek Montblanc pen. "Please, Arthur," I said, my voice smooth as aged bourbon. "Don't let me interrupt the performance. I'm eager to see how you plan to modernize my legacy." He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. He didn't hear the irony. He didn't see the fire. He just saw a 62-year-old woman he thought he'd successfully sedated with luxury and lies. He began his presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate gaslighting. He spoke about agility, digital integration, and the need for a younger, more relatable face for the brand. He flashed a slide on the screen, a photo of Serena at a gala, looking vibrant and approachable. The board members nodded like bobbleheads. They liked the idea of a younger face. They liked the idea of a man at the helm. I sat there watching Arthur's mouth move, marveling at the sheer audacity of his betrayal. He was essentially telling the room that I was too old to understand the world I had built. It was almost funny. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud when he mentioned transparency in asset management. Serena leaned in, whispering something in his ear, her hand grazing his shoulder in a way that was definitely not in the employee handbook. One of the older board members cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable, but Arthur just beamed. He was high on his own supply. He felt the power shifting. He felt the crown sliding onto his head. I reached into my bag and touched the cool, smooth surface of the silver envelopes. They were stacked neatly, a silent arsenal. My assistant entered the room, moving like a ghost, placing a sealed envelope in front of every person at the table. Arthur stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he looked at the silver-foiled package. "What's this, Eleanor? A gift for the board?" I leaned forward, the light from the window catching the diamonds at my throat. "In a way, Arthur. It's a study in provenance. I thought the board should see the real documentation before we vote on your transition." The room went silent. The air grew heavy. The silver envelope sat on the table like 20 unexploded grenades. "Open them," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning like a scalpel. The sound of 20 silver envelopes being torn open at once was a strangely satisfying symphony. It sounded like the end of something. I watched the board members. These were men who dealt in oil futures and skyscrapers, men who didn't flinch at billion-dollar losses. But as they pulled out the high-gloss 300-gram prints, their faces went through a fascinating transformation. Confusion, recognition, disgust. One of the younger analysts actually choked on his Starbucks. Arthur's hand shook as he reached for his own envelope. He pulled out the first image, a crystal-clear shot of him and Serena in the back of the Mercedes S-Class, her head on his shoulder, his hand where it definitely shouldn't have been for a strategy meeting. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him looking like a poorly restored fresco. "Eleanor, what is this theater?" he stammered, his eyes darting to Serena. She had turned the color of a curdled latte. I leaned back, tapping my Montblanc pen against the edge of my iPad Pro. "It's a visual audit, Arthur. You were talking about transparency and new assets. I thought I'd provide some high-resolution examples of where our corporate travel budget has been going." I looked at the third photo in the stack. It was a shot from the Ritz-Carlton. Serena was wearing a set of Cartier earrings that I recognized instantly. They were the ones Arthur told me had been lost in shipping for our anniversary. Seeing them on her 28-year-old earlobes felt like a physical blow to my stomach. For a second, the cold mask I was wearing nearly cracked. I felt a surge of that old, pathetic grief, the kind that makes you want to crawl into bed and stay there for a decade. But then I looked at Serena. Her lip filler was migrating in the high-res shot, making her look like a surprised pufferfish. A dry, sarcastic laugh escaped my throat. I must say, Serena, the lighting in the Ritz really doesn't do your complexion any favors. We should talk about your skincare routine in the exit interview. The room was a vacuum of awkwardness. One of the senior board members, a man who had been my father's protégé, cleared his throat. Arthur, this is highly irregular and frankly reprehensible. Arthur tried to stand, his Tom Ford suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. This is a private matter. This has nothing to do with the vote, he yelled, his voice cracking. He looked at the board, desperate for an ally. She's using personal drama to distract you from the fact that the company is stagnating. She's an emotional woman who can't handle a younger man's ambition. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at my MacBook Pro and hit a key, casting a new document onto the massive 98-inch screen at the end of the room. It wasn't a photo. It was a spreadsheet. A very detailed, very illegal spreadsheet. You're right, Arthur. The cheating is a private matter. A pathetic, cliché, midlife crisis matter. But the wire transfers to Serena Consulting LLC in the Cayman Islands, that's very much a board matter. The silence returned, heavier this time. Arthur stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. He looked like a man who had just realized he wasn't the hunter, but the specimen pinned to the wall. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness amidst the triumph. 15 years. I had given this man 15 years of my life, my trust, and my bed. And he had spent that time looking for the exit door with his pockets full of my jewelry. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I was 62 and I was standing in the ruins of my personal life. But as I looked at Arthur's crumbling face, I realized I wasn't the one who was lost. I was the one who was finally, painfully awake. He started to say something, a plea or a lie, but I simply raised my hand. The second act was over. The third act was about to involve handcuffs. Arthur stood there, his jaw working silently like a fish gasping for air in a dry bucket. The board members were leaning in now, their expensive glasses reflecting the damning numbers on the screen. It's a glitch, Arthur finally wheezed, grabbing the edge of the obsidian table. Eleanor, you've always been prone to dramatic interpretations. This is just a complicated tax shelter. It's for the benefit of the firm. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second, I felt a wave of genuine pity. It's a terrible thing to watch a man realize his own mediocrity in real time. A tax shelter, Arthur? Using my private social security number and the forged signature of a dead notary? I tapped my MacBook Pro, the screen flickering as I pulled up the next file. You've always had such a creative imagination. It's a shame you didn't apply it to something less felonious. I took a slow sip of my cold espresso. The bitterness was grounding. But let's talk about art, shall we? Since that is, after all, why we are here. I hit another key. The screen split into 2 high-resolution images of a 17th-century Dutch masterpiece, my Vermeer. To the untrained eye, they were identical. To me, the one on the left looked like a cheap postcard. The board might be interested to know that the original Vermeer, which has been in the Sterling family for 3 generations, is currently sitting in a shipping crate at JFK Airport. Destination, a private villa in Dubai. I heard a collective gasp. In the world of high-end auctions, this was the equivalent of a nuclear strike. Arthur's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. Serena, who had been trying to shrink into her chair, suddenly found her voice. I didn't know about the painting, I swear. He told me it was an insurance appraisal. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperation that was almost funny. Eleanor, please, I was just doing my job. I laughed, a sharp staccato sound that echoed off the glass walls. Oh, Serena, your job was to authenticate beauty, not to sleep with the furniture. Though, given your performance in those Ritz-Carlton photos, I suppose you were doing both. The room erupted into a low hum of whispers. One of the investors leaned over and whispered to his colleague, God, she's brutal. I took it as a compliment. At 62, brutal is just another word for efficient. Arthur tried to make a run for it. He actually stood up and headed for the door, his leather briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. He tripped over the cord of the projector. a piece of technology he'd insisted on upgrading last month, and went sprawling onto the carpet. It was a pathetic, ungraceful heap of Tom Ford wool and shattered ego. I watched him scramble to his feet, his silver hair disheveled, looking every bit the 55-year-old con man he was. "Where are you going, Arthur?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden silence. "The meeting isn't over. We haven't even gotten to the part where you explain why you replaced my Cartier collection with cubic zirconia." He froze, his hand on the door handle. He looked back at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the man I had loved, the charming, eloquent partner who had sat with me on the deck in the Hamptons and talked about our future. But that man was a ghost, a carefully constructed forgery. The real Arthur was the one trembling in front of the door. I looked at my iPad, checking the time. Marcus had texted me 2 minutes ago. "They're in the lobby." I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the curator of my own life, and I was finally clearing out the fakes. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, a rhythmic thud that signaled the end of the Sterling marriage and the beginning of a very long, very legal nightmare for the man I'd shared my bed with. The oak doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they were breached. 2 men in charcoal suits, not the tailored Italian kind Arthur wore, but the stiff, functional kind that meant business, stepped in. Behind them were 2 uniformed NYPD officers. The air in the room, already heavy with the scent of Arthur's failing sweat and Serena's cheap desperation, suddenly turned clinical. "Arthur Sterling?" the lead agent asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He knew. We all knew. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on my iPad Pro, watching the man I had loved for 15 years shrink until he was nothing more than a smudge on the expensive Manhattan skyline. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur shouted, his voice reaching a pitch that was decidedly unsilver fox. He tried to straighten his Tom Ford blazer, but one side was tucked into his belt, making him look like a drunk at a wedding. "This is a private corporate meeting. Eleanor, tell them." I didn't tell them anything. I simply looked at Special Agent Miller, Marcus's contact, and nodded. Miller stepped forward, a pair of stainless steel handcuffs glinting under the LED recessed lighting. "Arthur Sterling, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and the interstate transportation of stolen property. You have the right to remain silent." The clink of the metal against Arthur's wrists was the most honest sound I'd heard in a decade. It was sharp, final. It sounded like the closing of a vault. Serena let out a sound that was half sob, half hiss. "He made me do it," she screamed, her eyes darting toward the open door. "He told me he was going to divorce her. He said she was losing her mind and he needed to save the gallery." She looked at me, her youthful face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly survival. "I have the emails, Eleanor. I have the recordings on my iPhone. He forced me to help him with the Vermeer." I felt a dry, cold amusement wash over me. I looked at the board members, who were now staring at Serena as if she were a cockroach on a white linen tablecloth. "Oh, Serena," I murmured, leaning back in my chair. "You really should have read your employment contract more carefully. There's a clause about moral turpitude, and another one about being an accessory to a felony." The officers began to lead Arthur toward the door. He stopped, digging his heels into the plush carpet, and looked back at me. His eyes weren't filled with love or even regret. They were filled with a frantic, animalistic rage. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You're 62, Eleanor. You're a relic. Without me, you're just an old woman in a big house with a bunch of dead men's paintings." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a momentary ghost of the woman who used to believe him. But then I looked at my MacBook Pro, which was still recording the entire session for the SEC. I looked at my Cartier watch, ticking away the seconds of my new life. "I may be 62, Arthur," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "But I'm a 62-year-old who owns the house, the gallery, and the very air you're currently breathing. You, on the other hand, are just a guest who stayed too long and stole the silver." As they dragged him out, he tripped again, this time over his own ego. The hallway was already buzzing with the flashes of cameras. I had made sure the press knew that a major announcement was coming from Sterling Fine Arts. They weren't expecting a perp walk, but New York loves a scandal involving high society and higher stakes. I watched the door close behind them. The boardroom was silent now, save for the frantic tapping of the investors' fingers on their own devices. They were already calculating the stock drop, the PR damage, and the recovery. I stood up, smoothing my Dior skirt. I felt like I had just finished a marathon in heels. My feet ached, my heart felt like it had been through a shredder, but my head was finally, gloriously clear. The silence that followed the slamming of the boardroom doors was heavier than the betrayal itself. I stood at the head of the obsidian table, the sole survivor of a shipwreck I had orchestrated. The board members, men who usually smelled of old money and overpriced cigars, were now scurrying out like rats from a sinking vessel, their thumbs flying across their BlackBerries and iPhones to sell off their shock before the stock market opened. I watched them go. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I was Eleanor Sterling, and for the first time in 15 years, I was alone in a room that finally felt like mine again. I sat back down, the leather of the executive chair sighing under my weight. I looked at the 20 silver envelopes scattered across the table. My life was a lot that had failed to meet the reserve price. I picked up Arthur's discarded Mont Blanc pen. He'd left it behind in his haste to be handcuffed. I rolled it between my fingers, a dry, sarcastic chuckle escaping my throat. He always did have a penchant for leaving things behind, his dignity, his loyalty, and now his freedom. I imagined him in the back of the police cruiser, his bespoke suit gathering dust, trying to explain to a board officer that he was a visionary. It was almost funny. In fact, it was hilarious. I leaned my head back and laughed until my chest ached, a sharp, staccato sound that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Park Avenue. I laughed until the laughter turned into something else, something jagged and hot that burned the back of my throat. The tears didn't come in a flood. They came like a leak in a dam, silent, cold, persistent. At 62, I knew that crying was a luxury I usually couldn't afford. But here, in the vacuum of the Hearst Tower, I let them fall. They landed on the high-gloss print of Arthur and Serena at the Ritz. I watched a tear slide down Serena's perfectly contoured cheek, blurring the image of the Cartier earrings he'd stolen from my vault. It's a strange thing to be a billionaire and feel like a bankrupt girl. I had all the Vermeer originals back, the bank accounts were being frozen, and the empire was secure. But my heart felt like a piece of canvas that had been sliced by a vandal's knife. 15 years. I had traded the best years of my maturity for a man who viewed me as an ATM with a pulse. I pulled a silk Hermès scarf from my Birkin and dabbed my eyes. "Pull it together, Eleanor," I whispered to the empty room. "You have a press release to approve and a legacy to duct tape back together." I opened my MacBook Pro. The news was already breaking. NY Post, art mogul arrested in boardroom coup. Wall Street Journal, Sterling fine arts scandal rocks Manhattan. The comments sections were a cesspool of ageism and glee. People loved to see the powerful fall, especially women of a certain age. One user, probably sitting in a basement in Ohio, commented, "Guess the old bird wasn't enough for him." I smiled, a thin, razor-sharp expression. That old bird was about to make sure Arthur Sterling spent the next decade eating mystery meat in a federal cafeteria. I left the boardroom and headed for the private elevator. As I stepped out into the lobby, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi hit me like a physical wave. They were shouting, shoving, desperate for a shot of the scorned wife. James, my driver, stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the worst of the chaos. He opened the door of the Mercedes S-Class, the scent of expensive leather and air-conditioned calm welcoming me back. As we pulled away from the curb, I saw a tabloid reporter holding up a phone with a picture of Serena. I didn't look away. I looked right through the lens. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like the woman who owned the building, the car, and the very ground they were standing on. I reached into the mini fridge and poured myself a glass of chilled Pellegrino. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "The Vermeer is back in the vault. Arthur is being processed. Drink some wine, Eleanor. You earned it." I felt a small, genuine warmth spread through my chest. Marcus was 65 and had the emotional range of a granite slab, but he was loyal. Loyal was better than charming. Loyal was better than toasted almond skin and lies. I looked out the window as we passed Central Park. The trees were turning gold, a beautiful, natural aging process that no amount of Swiss serum could replicate. I realized I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning the most expensive, most satisfying renovation project of my life. And this time, I wouldn't be using any fakes. 2 weeks later, the Hamptons smelled of salt air and expensive closure. I sat on the wraparound porch of my beach house, wrapped in a cashmere Hermès throw that cost more than Arthur's first car. The Atlantic was restless, gray waves crashing against the shore with a rhythmic staccato persistence. My MacBook Air sat on my lap, the screen glowing with the latest headlines. The Fall of the House of Sterling. Arthur Sterling, from Park Avenue to Rikers Island. The tabloids had been relentless. There was a grainy photo of Arthur being led into a courtroom, his silver hair unwashed, his $5,000 suit looking like a thrift store reject under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked exactly like what he was, a 55-year-old man who had bet his life on a lie and lost. I took a sip of my Starbucks, a simple black coffee, no foam, no nonsense. I'd grown tired of the complicated lattes Arthur used to bring me as peace offerings. Beside me, an Amazon box sat half open, containing my latest attempt at healing. A copy of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and a new Kindle Paperwhite. I felt a dry, sarcastic smile tug at my lips. At 62, you'd think I'd have mastered the art of not caring, but apparently, even a billionaire needs a refresher course when her husband tries to sell her Dutch masters for a mistress's collagen injections. I glanced at the book cover. The title felt like a personal mantra. I was done giving my fucks to men who treated my heart like a flip house. The legal fallout had been a bloodbath. My lawyer, Diane, had moved with the surgical precision of a great white. Arthur's assets, the ones he hadn't already embezzled, were frozen. The penthouse was back in my name. The joint accounts were purged. Even the Mercedes he'd used for his trysts had been seized as part of the evidence in the art theft case. As for Serena, her influencer dreams had died in a deposition room. She'd tried to claim she was a victim of Arthur's charismatic manipulation. But the high-res photos I'd printed of her wearing my Cartier earrings while drinking my 1945 Bordeaux made her look less like a victim and more like a common shoplifter with a better wardrobe. I heard she was working at a mid-tier gallery in Jersey now. The irony was delicious. From the Ritz-Carlton to a strip mall in Secaucus. I spent the afternoon on a Zoom call with my new board of directors. It was a younger, sharper crowd. No more good old boys who nodded when Arthur spoke. I was back in the CEO chair, and the stock price, after a brief terrifying dip, was climbing again. People respected a woman who could take a hit and then hand the perpetrator his own head on a silver platter. "We're rebranding, Eleanor," one of the consultants said, his voice coming through the MacBook speakers. Strength, authenticity. The Sterling standard. I liked the sound of that. Authenticity was a rare commodity in Manhattan. Most people spent their whole lives trying to be a better version of someone else. I was finally happy just being the original. There were moments of humor, of course. My sister Clara had tried to set me up on a Silver Fox dating app. I spent 10 minutes scrolling through profiles of 60-year-old men posing with fish or sitting in Ferraris they clearly couldn't afford to maintain. One man messaged me, "Hey beautiful, wanna see my collection of rare coins?" I blocked him immediately. "Clara," I told her over the phone, "if I wanted to see old, shiny things that don't do anything, I'd go back to the auction house." We both laughed until we were breathless. It was a good sound. A real sound. I was 62, single, and arguably the most powerful woman in the New York art world. I didn't need a coin collector. I needed a vacation. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Marcus walked up the beach path. He wasn't wearing his FBI suit. He was in a simple navy sweater and chinos, carrying a bag from a local seafood shack. He looked his age, 65, and he looked comfortable in his skin. He didn't have a pitch. He didn't have a plan to modernize me. He just had 2 lobster rolls and a bottle of cold Sancerre. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, leaning against the railing. I looked at him, then back at the ocean. The house was quiet. The empire was safe. My heart was still in pieces, but the glue was starting to set. "I am, Marcus," I said, closing my laptop. "I really am." The Southern District of New York courthouse is where the important meetings of the criminal class take place, and today was Arthur's grand finale. The air inside the courtroom smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the quiet, crushing weight of reality. I sat in the front row, wearing a charcoal Chanel suit that felt like armor. I had my MacBook Pro open on my lap, not because I was working, but because the glowing Apple logo seemed to irritate Arthur's lawyer. Beside me sat Marcus, his presence as steady as a stone wall. I took a final sip of my Starbucks, black, no sugar, just like my outlook on my marriage, and waited for the judge to emerge. At 62, I've learned that the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they have a marvelous way of grinding liars into very fine dust. When the side door opened and the bailiff called for us to rise, Arthur was led in. He wasn't wearing Tom Ford today. He was wearing a drab, oversized navy blazer that looked like it had been borrowed from a thrift store, and his wrists were bound by stainless steel. He had lost weight. The toasted almond tan had faded into a sickly, fluorescent bulb gray. He looked every bit of his 55 years, and then some. He tried to catch my eye, a flicker of that old, manipulative charm crossing his face. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry, Elle." I felt a dry, sarcastic laugh catch in my throat. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I just adjusted my glasses and looked at him like he was a particularly poorly executed forgery, something to be noted, documented, and then discarded. The judge, a woman in her 70s with eyes that could freeze a radiator, didn't waste time. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "You have been found guilty of wire fraud, grand larceny, and the systematic theft of cultural heritage. You didn't just steal money. You betrayed the trust of a woman who was the architect of your success. You treated a storied career like a personal piggy bank." I watched Arthur's shoulders slump. He looked like a balloon that had been pricked by a very expensive needle. Behind him, Serena was notably absent. I'd heard she was currently being deposed in a separate civil suit for the commingling of my Cartier diamonds. It turns out, when you're facing 15 years, love has a very short shelf life. The sentence was read, 12 years in a federal facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Total restitution of all embezzled funds. Every asset he had tried to hide, the Cayman's account, the secret condo in Miami, the storage unit filled with my grandmother's silverware, was now under the control of a court-appointed receiver. He was quite literally a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a very long time to think about his choices. As the bailiff led him toward the door that leads to the cells, Arthur stopped and turned back one last time. "Eleanor," he cried, his voice echoing with a pathetic, hollow desperation. "You can't do this. We have a life together." I stood up, closing my MacBook Pro with a crisp, final click. I walked toward the bar, leaning in just enough so only he could hear me. "We did have a life, Arthur," I whispered, my voice as calm as a summer morning in the Hamptons. "But like that Vermeer you tried to steal, it was just a very clever imitation. I've decided to move on to the originals." I watched the light go out of his eyes, the realization that the old bird hadn't just survived him, she had erased him. He was led away, his footsteps fading into the hallway, leaving behind nothing but the faint, lingering scent of his cheap, courtroom-ordered cologne. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright, biting New York sunshine. The paparazzi were there, of course, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. But I didn't hide. I put on my oversized Dior sunglasses and walked straight toward my waiting Mercedes. I felt a strange, bubbling sensation in my chest, a laugh that wasn't sarcastic or dry, but light. I looked at Marcus, who was holding the door open for me. "You know, Marcus," I said, sliding onto the cool leather seat, "I think I'm going to go home and redecorate. I'm tired of looking at things that don't belong in my house." He smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "I think that's an excellent idea, Eleanor." As we pulled away from the curb, I realized that 62 wasn't the end of the gallery. It was just the grand reopening. The penthouse finally breathed. The heavy, velvet curtains Arthur had loved, those suffocating drapes that felt like theater props for a marriage that never existed, were gone. In their place was sheer white linen that caught the Manhattan sunset, turning the room into a cathedral of gold and light. I sat on my vintage velvet sofa, my MacBook Pro resting on the marble coffee table. I was finalizing the sale of the last piece of bad luck in my life. I'd auctioned off Arthur's entire watch collection. Every Rolex, every Patek Philippe. The proceeds were already being wired to a foundation for displaced women. I felt a sharp, sarcastic thrill as I clicked the mouse, from his wrist to a roof over someone's head. Justice had a very satisfying, digital click to it. I picked up my Kindle, scrolling through Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I needed the stoicism. I needed the reminder that the only thing I truly owned was my own mind. At 62, my body felt different, lighter, more grounded, more electric. The frantic, exhausting need to prove I was still relevant to a younger man had evaporated along with the man who had exploited it. I looked at the new Cartier bracelet on my left wrist. I'd bought it for myself last Tuesday at the boutique on Fifth Avenue. No secret meaning. No hidden files. No betrayal attached, just a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that didn't lie. I took a sip of my Starbucks, a simple cold brew, bitter and cold, and watched the lights of the city flicker on. New York was still there. I was still here. We were both older, scarred, and infinitely more interesting than the children playing at power in the streets below. A soft melodic chime echoed through the foyer. It was Marcus. He didn't come with the performative fanfare Arthur used to employ, no oversized bouquets of lilies or rehearsed apologies that tasted like copper. He came with a small, artisanal box of chocolates from a shop in the village, and a look in his eyes that didn't require an appraisal. He sat down next to me, his presence a calm, sturdy weight. The scent of his woodsy cologne, something honest and deep, replaced the cloying synthetic smell of Arthur's expensive pomade. "The gallery is thriving, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, comforting hum that settled in my bones. "The Sterling name is once again the gold standard. People aren't talking about the scandal anymore. They're talking about your eye." I leaned my head on his shoulder. It felt solid. It felt like home. At 62, the touch of a man who actually knows who you are is worth more than any Dutch masterpiece. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about the wire fraud, the federal sentencing, or the pathetic letters Arthur had been trying to send from prison. We talked about the future. We talked about a trip to Florence. Not for an auction, not for a client, but just to walk through the Uffizi and hold hands in the dark. The idea of a new beginning felt less like a fairy tale and more like a hard-won victory. I felt a surge of warmth, a quiet, blooming heat that had nothing to do with the desperate fire of youth and everything to do with the steady glow of being truly seen. Later that evening, as the Manhattan skyline twinkled like a sea of fallen stars, Marcus took my hand. His skin was lined, his grip firm and respectful. There was a different kind of sexual tension at our age, a slow, deliberate electricity that didn't need the frantic energy of a 28-year-old's insecurity. It was a shared language of survival. It was the absolute comfort of knowing that the person next to you wasn't looking for a way out. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not a tear of grief, but of profound, bone-deep relief. I was Eleanor Sterling. I had survived a forgery, a theft, and a 15-year lie. I had burned down the fake world Arthur built to find the diamond hidden in the ashes. I closed my eyes, listening to the heartbeat of the city, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel the need to look behind me. I was finally home. 6 months later, the morning air in the Hamptons felt like a fresh coat of varnish on a weary soul. I sat on my deck, the sun warming the wood beneath my bare feet. A letter sat on the glass table next to my MacBook Pro. It was a drab, gray envelope with a return address from a federal correctional facility in upstate New York. Arthur. His handwriting was still flamboyant, full of the unnecessary flourishes of a man who thought he was too charming to be caged. I didn't open it. I didn't need to hear his latest investment opportunity or his tearful plea for a second chance. I simply used the envelope as a coaster for my Starbucks cup. The condensation from the cold brew seeped into his name, blurring the ink until Arthur Sterling was nothing more than a blue, watery smudge. It was the most useful thing he'd done for me in years. I looked at my Kindle, where I was rereading a poem about the beauty of autumn. At 62, I realized that the best part of life isn't the spring, it's the harvest. It's knowing which fruits are real and which are just wax. Marcus walked out onto the porch, carrying 2 plates of fresh fruit and a soft woolen blanket. He didn't say anything. He just draped the blanket over my shoulders and sat beside me. His hand found mine, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic, staccato pulse of the ocean against the shore. I felt a deep, quiet hum of contentment. The gallery was flourishing, the forgeries were gone, and the man beside me knew the difference between an asset and a soul. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes against the gold of the rising sun. I wasn't just Eleanor Sterling, the art mogul. I was Eleanor, a woman who had finally learned that the most priceless masterpiece in the world is a heart that is finally, beautifully at peace.